August 19, 1948. The iconic Bund waterfront in Shanghai. Tens of thousands of citizens had been lining up since dawn outside the central bank. They carried leather suitcases, rice sacks, and wooden wheelbarrows overflowing with worthless banknotes. Welcome to Plexo. The Chinese nationalist government printed so much paper money to save its regime that it ended up financing its own destruction at the hands of Mao Zedong. Everything collapsed under the weight of an exchange rate of 3 million to 1. World War II was over, but China was still bleeding from a civil war between nationalists and communists. To fund their armies, the state had turned money printing into its only financial strategy. The result was an arithmetic catastrophe that devoured Asia's largest economy. On the streets of Shanghai, inflation was so wild that stores closed at noon to reprice their goods. A gallon of gasoline cost 3 million yuan. Office workers collected their salaries in blocks of paper tied with string. Rickshaw passengers weighed less than the huge stacks of bills needed to pay for the ride. Money had lost its basic function. It was no longer a store of value, but a radioactive commodity that burned in your hands. People rushed to spend their wages before nightfall, because by dawn that same money wouldn't buy a single grain of rice. The financial system was clinically dead, and the government was preparing one last experiment that would speed up its own burial. The architect of this disaster wasn't an economist, but a military man. Chiang Kai-shek, with his perpetual martial posture, shaved head, and cold stare that brooked no dissent, ruled the Republic of China with an iron fist. His absolute obsession was wiping out Mao Zedong's communists, no matter the financial cost. By 1946, military spending consumed 60% of the national budget, but tax revenues barely covered a fraction of that. Chiang's solution was the oldest and most destructive in economic history: fire up the printing presses. The government monopolized the money supply and began issuing the Fabi Yuan with zero backing. Local machinery couldn't keep up with the pace the generals demanded. Cargo planes flew over the Himalayas, packed with tons of freshly printed banknotes from England, landing in China only to flood an already saturated market. In 1937, there were 3.6 billion yuan in circulation. A decade later, that number had mutated to nearly 61 trillion. The official currency became so diluted that peasants returned to barter, and urban merchants demanded payment in US dollars or silver. Chiang Kai-shek had created an inflationary monster that devoured public trust, the only pillar that holds up any government. Yet instead of cutting spending, the regime blamed speculators and launched a monetary reform. The cruel paradox: the promised cure would be signed by the same man who had started the fire. In August 1948, the government took a desperate measure to save state finances. They announced a new currency, the gold yuan, to replace the old, devalued Fabi. The conversion rate was a mathematical insult: 3 million old yuan for each new gold yuan. To enforce this fiction, the regime issued a draconian decree, forcing all citizens to turn over their gold, silver, and foreign currency to the central bank. Chiang Kai-shek sent his own son, Chiang Ching-kuo, to Shanghai to enforce the law. Dubbed the Tiger Hunter, the younger Chiang arrested wealthy merchants, forcibly froze prices, and threatened public executions for anyone hiding precious metals. For a few weeks, terror worked, and shop windows filled with goods again. But the government made a fatal mistake: it kept printing the new currency to fund the war, destroying its value almost immediately. When the public realized the gold yuan was also worthless paper, panic swept the streets. In December 1948, terrified crowds tried to recover their savings. That winter, dozens of people were crushed to death against the bronze doors of the central bank in Shanghai, victims of a desperate stampede to buy gold before their money lost all value. The state had confiscated its people's real wealth in exchange for useless IOUs, signing its own political death warrant. Hyperinflation didn't just destroy bank accounts, it shattered China's social fabric. The urban middle class, teachers, doctors, civil servants, small business owners, was the core support of the nationalist government. These families had obeyed the law, turning over their life savings for gold yuan. In just a few months, that patriotism condemned them to absolute misery. When the currency collapsed again, they realized the government had legally looted them. Resentment turned into deep hatred for Chiang Kai-shek. While ordinary citizens couldn't afford a head of cabbage, corrupt regime officials amassed fortunes on the black market. In exclusive clubs of the French concession, tycoons lit their imported cigars with 10,000 yuan notes because paper money was worth less than matchsticks. By spring 1949, the economic collapse achieved what Mao Zedong's military tactics alone could not: it annihilated the people's will to resist. Nationalist soldiers, whose paper salaries could no longer buy food, began deserting en masse. Generals sold their weapons to the enemy for real gold. China's major cities, exhausted by hunger and financial chaos, stopped fighting. The ground was perfectly prepared for the final advance of the People's Liberation Army, marching into an economically surrendered country. And then came the ultimate irony: the army that claimed to defend China was defeated not by Mao, but by its own printing press. In May 1949, communist troops entered Shanghai with almost no resistance. They found a paralyzed metropolis, where the gold yuan had collapsed to absurd levels. On the black market, the exchange rate had hit 95 million yuan for a single US dollar. But the leaders of the nationalist government were no longer around to witness the final act of their financial tragedy. Weeks before the city fell, Chiang Kai-shek had executed a massive covert operation. In the dark holds of nationalist warships, secretly loaded overnight, more than 115 metric tons of gold bars were shipped to the island of Taiwan. They took the country's real reserves, leaving millions of citizens trapped with mountains of worthless paper. The Communist Party gained enormous initial legitimacy, simply by stopping hyperinflation and creating the renminbi, a currency people could finally use to buy food. Military history often focuses on the battles of the Chinese Civil War, but it was the systematic destruction of money that truly brought down the Republic of China government. By confiscating their own people's gold and handing them paper, the nationalists financed their own defeat. Chinese nationalism didn't die on the battlefield, it was executed by a printing press that turned a nation's savings into ashes.